Today is quilting day, except technically it's not quilting. So patchwork blanket day, because I have learned that quilting is when there is the layer of batting in between materials, so I will not be having a layer of batting. So I guess it's just a patchwork blanket, not a quilt. But for those of you that know me, know that I am a patchwork scrap project type of person. I do a lot of scraps projects, and despite all of the scraps projects that I do, I still have an overwhelming amount of scraps. I'll actually show you. I keep all of my scraps in this bucket, scraps that are too small for like certain projects that I do. So yeah, once the scraps get too small, I put them in this bucket. And this is actually a very small amount of scraps that I currently have. It was overflowing. And so I was trying to think of a project that would use the most amount of scraps in like the quickest way possible. And I decided blanket was the way to go. So this has been in the works for a little bit. So I already have a bunch of squares. I just took out all my scraps and started piecing them together into making whatever squares I possibly could. The goal for this project was efficiency, but also I wanted to practice my patchwork skills and kind of experiment some stuff. So all of my squares look a little bit different. They all have kind of different designs going on so that I could practice my patchwork ideas. And so now that I made all of these squares, I'm going to chop them up so that they're all evenly sized, and then I'm going to sew them all together to make a giant blanket. And these are all towel scraps because of my towel clothing brand that I do. So that's why I always have an overwhelming amount of specifically towel scraps. So that's what I'm using for this blanket is towel. So it's gonna make a perfect beach blanket, and I'm probably gonna back it with just a sheet. So yeah, here we go.
I ended up making 81 squares. The goal was to do a 9x9 quilt, and now I'm going to cut all of the squares into 10-inch by 10-inch squares. So the quilt is going to be about 90 inches by 90 inches. I came up with this because I googled how big is a queen comforter. Oh, and quick side note, I am aware that this oval piece is not cute, but my little sister did make it for me, so I will include it in the quilt. Anyway, back to the sizing. So once I sew it all together, the seam allowances will shrink it down a little bit, but it'll be about the size of a queen size comforter. I'm really excited about the way that some of these squares turned out, the patchwork patterns. Some of them ended up looking really cool, some of them not so cute, but I was here for the experimenting. So I laid them all out and didn't really pay too much attention to what was going next to what until I had the whole layout established. And then I rearranged a couple pieces to make it flow a little bit better. And here's the final design that I settled on. It's a little chaotic, but fun. And now back to business. I sewed all the squares together into rows, and I had 9 rows to sew together. So here's a rapid fire of me laying down all of the finished rows of the blanket. And then it was time to sew the rows together. This was definitely the worst part of the whole project. I broke a lot of needles because some of those seams really lined up on top of each other. It was getting so big, I decided to sew the rows together in sets of 3 and then sew the sets of 3 together so that it was a little bit easier to manage. I didn't have to navigate a massive quilt every time I was adding on a new row. And now for the backing. I thrifted this sheet. It's just a navy blue linen sheet, cotton sheet. And I laid it out on the floor, stretching it out to be as flat as possible. And then I topped it with my quilt. So I laid the sheet so that it was right side facing down, and then the quilt right side facing up. And I decided that I needed to attach them together in more places than just at the end. So I started doing little yarn knots at the corners of the squares. I didn't do it at every single corner, and yes, I did have to use pliers to pull the needle through, the yarn needle through, because it was really thick. But once I got that all tied up, then I started cutting my binding. I cut 2 inches all around the blanket, and I folded it over 1 inch and then folded over another inch so that it laid 1 inch on top of the quilt, if that makes sense. And then I pinned it down. The more pins, the better. I didn't do a great job at pinning it down, but I pinned about every 10 inches. So it's just hard to keep everything so tight when you're working with such a massive project and when you don't really have anything to pull it tight, when you're just doing it on the floor. Hard to keep it all in line. And then to sew the backing or the binding on, I just followed the edge of that fold over part of the sheet and sewed it all the way around. I'm not showing you how I did the corners because I didn't do them that great. But basically I just folded them over diagonally to make it as seamless or as pretty as possible.
Okay, are you guys as excited as I am? Here we go. The final product. I will admit to you right now, my binding up close is not the best. There's some puckers here and there, but you know, I'm not a quilter, so I'm pretty happy with it. And I think that if I had all the right tools, it could have turned out a little bit better, but alas, there we are. Okay, ready? Here it is, all the patchworks of my life, of my year, in one giant beach quilt. Yay! I'm so excited. I think that it turned out really cool, and I think I'm going to really enjoy using it. Thank you for joining me on my patchwork quilt journey. Now I must go enjoy it at the beach for sunset. So, yep. Bye!